Citizens out tonight, and it's proof positive that people are interested in useful discussion and debate. That's a good thing. My name is Eugene Peterson. I'm the chair of the Anne Arundel County Human Relations Commission. And we're here today to put on this forum for discussion, understanding, questions, and hopefully you can leave with something you didn't know before you came in. That's always a good thing. Our larger charge in the county is to promote better understanding among all people in the county, so that we can meet the county executive and the council's goal, as you know, to make Anne Arundel County the best place for all. And we're committed to that. I believe that these kind of forums can generate that kind of cohesion within the county. We can have disagreements. We can vote for different people. We can support different people. But we must have useful dialogue, or it's all lost. And I think we're in a better place than some of the other elected folks who seem to be having a good time shouting at one another nationally, but not doing much to, in a bipartisan way, move the needle. But I'm a hopeful person. And I see a lot of hopeful people out here today. I'd like to go through some ground rules. We're going to have some index cards passed out with pencils or pens, whatever it may be, for you to jot down any questions that you might want answered during the question and answer period after the panel presentations and discussions. The cards will be passed out after I leave the podium and introduce our moderator. So if you would bear with us for a little while after I finish and our moderator gets up here, she'll let you know when everybody who wants a card has a card. And if you get passed over, raise your hand and we'll get you a card. I'd like to introduce a good friend of mine and our moderator for tonight, Georgia A. New-Sherrard. Now, Georgia and I met when I got appointed to the commission, and she was vice chair and then for a while interim chair of the commission. Served us well in a time of transition. She presently is the director of the Anne Arundel County Conflict Resolution Center, and she is a professionally trained mediator who actively mediates with both the circuit and district courts, pre-trial and day of trial programs. Georgia and the Anne Arundel County Conflict Resolution Center work closely with the Partnerships for Children and Youth and Families, the Department of Health, Aging and Disabilities, Social Services, the Police Department, Anne Arundel County Development Services, Economic Development, the Anne Arundel County branch of the NAACP, and the Caucus for African American Leaders. Georgia holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Communications from Lamar University. I believe that's in Texas, am I right? Okay. A Master's of Arts in Legal and Ethical Studies from the University of Baltimore. And she is currently, and I really appreciate this because I never got there, currently a doctoral candidate in public administration, public policy at the University of Baltimore. She is also a United Nations Association graduate fellow. Prior to joining the Conflict Resolution Center, She served as Deputy Director of the ACLU in Washington's Legislative Office. She was the Chief Administrative Officer, National Field Director, and Southwestern Regional Director of the National NAACP. She was a development consultant to the Houston branch of the NAACP and a director with the ACS, American Constitution Society, and an intern with Maryland Legal Aid. Can we now begin to pass out the index cards, and let me bring up my good friend, Georgia Noon-Sherrod.
Thank you, Eugene. You are an amazing friend. And actually, we met because Eugene and his wife are lovers of jazz. And my husband is a jazz artist here locally. And so that's how we initially met. And he walked up to me and was like, man, I love your husband's music, right? And so that's how we developed a relationship. So when I saw him, his name on the list of members for the commission, I was like, I know somebody that's really cool, that's my friend. So thank you so much. I want to also thank the Anne Arundel County Human Relations Commission. Would all the commissioners please stand so you can be recognized? Those who are here, who are present. Mary. Ms. Shirley, thank you so much for, first of all, hosting this morning. Really interesting, and former, by the way. I think we have a former commissioner in the audience as well. Dick, how are you? I want to thank you for having the courage to put on this forum. So real quickly, we're going to spend about 10 minutes doing the introduction of the panelists. As I introduce the panelists, I'd ask you to come up and join us here. Right now, we're passing out cards. So again, please write down any questions you have. At some point, we will collect those cards, and we'll spend about 35 to 40 minutes answering the questions after we've gone over our specific questions that we have for questions that we've designed for the panelists ahead of that, okay? So without further ado, welcome to the Human Relations Commission's Critical Race Theory Forum. The evening's forum will delve into a number of questions. First and foremost, what is critical race theory? Our panel of experts, they're going to be made up of local activists and educators and academics to help us explore the social, educational, and academic impact of an ongoing and what some might say is a controversial discussion on this topic, and help us to really understand what critical race theory is and what it is not. Oftentimes, words are used, topics, to obfuscate from the real issue. And so I think it's important that as a county, we should model what we want other counties to do. And I think that begins with having a good, solid understanding of what critical race theory is. Therefore, I'm going to go into introducing our panelists. I'll begin with Dr. Lorenzo Hughes, if you will join us on the stage. Dr. Hughes holds a Doctorate of Philosophy in Organizational Leadership from the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. He serves as a Senior Manager of School Support and Equity Practices in the Office of Equity and Accelerating Student Achievement at Anne Arundel County Public Schools. In this capacity, Dr. Hughes supports supports executive and school leadership to, quote, evaluate all students, eliminate all gaps, which is the vision of Anne Arundel County Public Schools, their new strategic plan. Dr. Hughes facilitates professional development focused on equity and works to strengthen community partnerships. He's best characterized as a transformational leader who is unapologetically about the fierce advocacy of children whose opportunity to succeed has been marginalized by inequities and systematic racism. He is an anti-bias, anti-racist educational leader and a fearless about challenging the status quo of those who seek to uphold it. Dr. Lorenzo Hughes. Our next participant is very special to us. She's one of our very own. She's a student leader. Ms. Bunmi, now please help me, Bunmi. Boomy. I'm sorry. Is that how you pronounce your name? I want to make sure I get it correct.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. She's a senior. Please come up. She's a senior at Anne Arundel High School, the 48th student member of the Board of Education. Anne Arundel student member has held a full voting right since 1975, and she's the only member of, we are the only member of local school board in the nation with this status, that holds this status. She's a first-generation American whose parents immigrated from Nigeria. Bumi is a co-founder of Anne Arundel High School's Equity Leadership Council, a group formed to address school-wide equity concerns. In this role, she has planned and led a weekly forum that helps to create professional development content for the school's staff. In addition, she's led an anti-racism book study for students and staff to explore issues of race, facilitated a similar study that was open to members of Odenton, Crofton, Gambrills communities. She's a member of the board of directors of Convergence, a student-led organization created around spreading awareness of mental health issues and neurodiversity. You'll have to tell us about neurodiversity because I have no idea what that is. But thank you and welcome. Our next panelist is Stephen Waddy. Many of you probably know Stephen. He is a father of three from Severn, Maryland. Mr. Waddy is a political action chair of the Anne Arundel County NAACP. In that role, he has advocated on behalf of police reform policies in Anne Arundel County since March of 2018. He is also a licensed Maryland realtor and former legislative assistant with the ACLU, that's what we have in common, ACLU of Maryland, and the ACLU's federal lobbyist program, and so much more. His resume is exhaustive and fantastic. Mr. White, thank you for joining us. We have two academic professionals with us today, so pleased they could join us. Dr. Kamiko Royale, if you would join us on the stage. She's a PhD from Temple University in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. She's a master's from Johns Hopkins University in English Education. Dr. Royale, I love her name, is an urban education expert with 20 years of experience. Her work focuses on the intersection of race, politics, history, and urban school reform. In 2014, Dr. Royale returned to Baltimore as assistant professor of urban education at Loyola University, Maryland. There, she helped to launch the School of Education's Urban Education minor, and for 2 years, she led the Center of Innovation in Urban Education. Under her leadership, that organization externally facing worked aimed towards anti-racist, anti-oppression education in partnership with the urban schools and community organizations. The internally facing work was devoted to challenging colorblind racist ideology that permeates traditional pre-service preparation in service education development. Dr. Royale is very well published. She's recently, in April of this year, wrote a book, "To Not Paved for Us, Black Educators and Public Education Reform in Philadelphia." Ladies and gentlemen, our final panelist, Dr. Katia Salmi. Please join us. She has a Bachelor's of History and Bachelor's of Art in History and Anthropology from the University of Toronto, a Master's in Human Rights from the University College of London, and a PhD in Sociology from the University of Sussex in the UK. Her research focused on colorblind anti-racism. She studied in France for 2 years. She was a research fellow at Human Rights Watch, focusing on migration in North Africa, gender and health disparities in West Africa. She taught at American University, specifically in the area of sociology, power, privilege, and inequality. She is an associate professor in sociology now at Montgomery College as of January 2018. And she's a volunteer and consultant in Montgomery County with local government and nonprofit agencies. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Katya Salmi. And as you can see, we do have a very distinguished panel. So we will spend the next hour or so, right about an hour, going over a number of questions I'll ask of the panelists. We'll kind of move around. I'd like to begin with asking two questions of both Dr. Royal and Dr. Salmi. And so I'll direct this over. Once we're done with the questions, we'll kind of round that. We'll then spend the next 30 or 40 minutes asking your questions. And we'll collect your questions here shortly, okay? Again, does everyone have a card? If you don't, just raise your hand and someone from the back will bring you a card so you can write down your questions, okay? So I'll start with Dr. Royal. Can you please define critical race theory? Oh, before you answer the question, panelists, the microphones in front of you, they're turned off. When you get ready to speak, you can just press the button in front of you, hold it up, and speak carefully. You only need to press the button one time. That turns the microphone on. If you press it a second time, it turns it off. But just be careful as you're holding it because you could mute yourself, okay?
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
All right, so I had to pull up my notes from my class because I didn't want to skip anything. The first thing I'll start is the purpose of theory. So for those of us who study any field, but my field of study is education, one of the first classes, I know in sociology you all do the same thing because I took the classes in sociology, but one of the first things you do is take classes on theory, right? Theory is a way of viewing something. How do you view a phenomenon, or how do you view the world? So critical race theory is a way of viewing the world or society. It was developed in the 1970s by legal scholars. Okay? So legal studies is not my field. All right, so I just want to start with that. So Richard Delgado, I'm going to miss some of the legal scholars because honestly they're not my homies and I will study them. But so Richard Delgado, Derek Bell, being the person who was working on a lot of school desegregation cases. So in 1994-95, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's actually a graduate of Morgan State University, is a pedagogical theorist. In 1994 or 5, I think it's 5, she publishes an article along with William Tate, who is now the president of Louisiana State University. Gloria Ladson-Billings is emeritus from University of Wisconsin. Together they write an article called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. And that is how critical race theory first begins to come into the field of study in education specifically. Prior to that, most of the writing was Derek Bell and his sort of offspring writing about school desegregation cases and why there wasn't traction around school desegregation in the way it was supposed to be, okay? So when I'm teaching about sort of the tenets of critical race theory, start out with the idea that racism is what some people call racial realism. That is, that racism is systemic, endemic, and fully embedded in every facet of American life. That's the first one. The second is the idea of neutrality as problematic, right? Meritocracy, colorblindness, neutrality. The idea that we all have biases, and so it is thus impossible to be unbiased. And so what I often teach my students is that instead of pretending you're going to be unbiased, it's better for us to name what those biases are, so at least we're being honest with ourselves and others about our sort of orientation. So sometimes you'll hear educators talk about positionality, right? It's not that I'm sort of approaching this as this neutral person who doesn't live in the world, who's unscathed, but what is the position I occupy, and how does that cause me to approach this in this way, okay? The next thing would be this idea of narratives. So grand narratives. In critical race theory, the idea is that to sort of counter narratives, I would say counter narratives matter, especially the experiential knowledge of people of color. In education, a grand narrative would be that schools are the great equalizer. That's the grand narrative, right? But even the person who came up with this idea of schools as the great equalizer, who was the father of the common school movement, schools could not possibly have been the great equalizer when he was developing them, because there were still human beings in chains in this country at the same time. See? So there's this grand narrative, this big idea of what schools are supposed to be, and then there are people who say, but that's not sort of my experience with that phenomenon, okay? Another tenet, one of the most, I think, one that has been most beautifully written about, is whiteness as property. So for those of you who are interested in legal studies, there's an attorney named Cheryl Harris, and she wrote this phenomenal Harvard-published paper called Whiteness as Property. Now, if I were you, I would go get my drink of choice, some Pinot Grigio, maybe some Jack Daniels, whatever it is you like to sit down, because the article is about 55 pages long, and it's going to take you a minute to really sort of get into, all her historical arguments. But it's whiteness as property. It's the idea that whiteness has been the ultimate property in the United States of America. Then there's interest convergence. Interest convergence is something that Derek Bell was talking about when he was looking at why school desegregation legislation wasn't getting us these integrated schools that we were supposed to have. And so it was the idea that when they were trying to get white people to give up some of their benefits, they would only give up those benefits if you could name some tangible benefit for them to give them up. So it's interest convergence. That means that tenet argues that people will only consent to something that holds an interest for them, right? Not just because it's the right thing to do, but basically the question, what's in it for me? More recently, people who study critical race theory have talked about intersectionality, the idea that people have multiple identities that may be oppressed. So we can talk about something like patriarchy. For those in the room who may have an understanding of feminism and gender, we can talk about patriarchy and misogyny, but that patriarchy is experienced differently depending on one's racial identity, depending on one's financial status, depending on one's religious identity, right? So it's not just that, oh, I'm black and so this is how things are. I'm also a black woman, right? I also am a black woman who's a Christian. And depending on where I am in the world, those could be identities that intersect that cause me to experience oppression. Could be. And then there's microaggressions, which I personally never think are micro. Racist actions that seem on the surface to be minor, but are essentially indicative of larger racial issues. The biggest microaggression I have often experienced are people trying to touch my hair. Why would you touch a stranger without permission? This is not a zoo. I don't know why you would walk up to someone and start petting them like they're an animal, right? And so people say, oh, it's not that big of a deal, it's a microaggression, but it's my body, right? Why would you put your hand on somebody else's body without permission? So it seems like a minor thing, but to someone who you don't know, who may not want to be touched, right? It's kind of like, what's happening here? Why would you be touching me? Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simon.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to try to add on your great summary of what critical race theory is. And I just jotted down a couple of points that I thought maybe would add some additional context to what critical race theory is. One big question that critical race theory asks is, why is there still inequality? So, as Dr. Royale mentioned, it came about, this theoretical approach came about in the post-civil rights era. So post-civil rights, we've dismantled the Jim Crow segregation laws that were, the law of the land in many places. And yet, in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, we're still seeing inequalities based on race and in different life outcomes for people based on class and gender, but also more importantly, or just as importantly, based on race. And so what critical race theorists were trying to understand is why we still have these types of inequalities if we're in this post-civil rights era where the law says that we're equal. That's one key thing that they're trying to achieve in applying these theories. Also, critical race theory is a perspective that tries to erase this idea or move away from this idea of racism as just somebody's prejudicial individual thought, right? My neighbor doesn't like the way I look, that, you know, they're prejudicial against me. That's like that one-to-one interaction. But what CRT is trying to look at is how our social institutions, our education system, our government, our laws, our health systems, what have you, how these social institutions might be perpetuating racial inequalities along racial lines, even if they're not obviously trying to do that, even if they're not overtly saying we will treat black women who are giving birth worse than white women who are giving birth, because this is one example of like huge health disparities where black women do not receive the level of care that other women receive. So CRT tries to understand why these inequalities happen by looking at the system, racism as a system, rather than individual interactions and individual prejudicial beliefs. And one final thing that I want to add is that one big idea of critical race theory is really moving away from the idea of race as a biological reality. You know, so a lot of people still think that we can be distinguished, that humans can be divided in very neat racial categories based on genes. This is not true. This has been kind of an idea that's been dismantled, you know, kind of proven as not a reality. So what CRT does is base its foundation on race as a social construction. So race used as a tool to perpetuate oppression through slavery, colonialism, imperialism. But the main thing that we must all remember is even though race is, you know, kind of described as a social construct, it doesn't mean it's fake, right? Like people live their lives being discriminated against, having violence committed against them, being murdered because of their race. So the experience of race is very much real, and that's what CRT is trying to unpack and explain.
That was amazing. I've studied legal, my master's is in legal studies, and I don't think I've ever had it explained quite to me that way, the intersectionality portion, and focusing on the institutional concept. That's amazing. So thank you for that. We're going to now move on to individual questions for the panel. And I'd like to start with Dr. Hughes. Since you work the equity office of the school district, I want to specifically get to the heart of, I think, what a lot of people want to know about critical race theory and education at that level. Is critical race theory currently being taught in Anne Arundel County Public Schools? And that's the first question. The second question is, what has been the response from the community, specifically parents, guardians, advocacy organizations, so forth and so on, around critical race theory in public school?
Thank you. First of all, I want to bring greetings from Dr. Maisha Gillens, who is supposed to be the panelist. She's under the weather, and so I'm humbled that she allowed me to come and represent her, and so I do bring you greetings on behalf of Dr. Maisha Gillens. The answer to is critical race theory being taught in Anne Arundel County Public Schools is simple: no. As has been so eloquently explained, it is a theoretical concept. It is a way of thinking that helps us to understand that there are structural things that allow these things to be perpetuated. However, in 2020, the Anne Arundel County Board of Education did promulgate an equity policy, and in looking at the purpose for the policy, mentioned because the reason for this policy was looking at history and understanding the need that these structural inequities exist, the need to actually codify a policy which speaks to the necessity to have equity within the educational program. And as such, it is the mission of us to make sure that we're nurturing and educating all of our students to be well prepared to engage within the community, career entry into college, and empower them to have a better life for themselves and their communities and the next generation. And this is achieved by providing diverse, inclusive, and equitable curricula and materials that align with the Maryland State Department of Education's educational equity framework. Some other things that we looked at in getting the policy written was looking at the guidebook that the Maryland State Department of Education provided to all of the school districts to make sure that, again, that we are equitable in every facet and making sure that we're meeting all the students where they are and celebrating them and what they bring, and making sure that they're seeing themselves within the curriculum and it's being celebrated, and it's not necessarily seeing themselves in a demeaning way, but we get to see all aspects of themselves. So no, it's not being taught within the schools. What is the response been from the community? We have had community members who come and challenge whether or not we're actually if critical race theory is being taught within the schools. And as such, there was Dr. Gillens actually led a professional development for our board members entitled Social Topics in the Classroom, in which she did a walkthrough of various things that are being taught, that are actually being taught within the curriculum. And so I won't go into explaining critical race theory. I dare not after these academicians talk about that. But I think it is important to note that there is confusion, whether intentional or not, about the CRT, critical race theory, and CRT, culturally responsive teaching. We are insistent that our teachers be culturally responsive in their teaching. Why? Because we are blessed with a plethora of diversity within our schools, and it's important that the curriculum is a mirror and a window. It helps the students, whoever they are, whatever identity they have, that they're actually seeing themselves within the curriculum, and they're seeing all aspects of it, and not necessarily in a derogatory way. So that when they see African American characters in the book, they're not always the antagonist, or they're not always the slave, or being enslaved in that, and they'll be able to see themselves. So yes, we are making sure that we are having culturally responsive teachers and windows, right? So that they can not only see themselves, but see others. So that as I see anyone who is different from me, that I don't see that difference as deficient, but yet still celebrating the diversity that exists. So, no, critical race theory is not being taught in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. And again, we are making sure that we are providing a culturally responsive teaching. So it meets the needs of all students.
So the other CRT, and do you, just to follow up on that, do you get a lot of pushback that they're not the same thing? Are you seeing that, whether it's in emails and so forth and so on, that you're not disguising CRT, critical race theory, as cultural response? Because you talked about celebrating, I think it's wonderful. But I want the audience to really understand that we are not teaching critical race theory in Anne Arundel County Public Schools, that we are teaching culturally responsive teaching, and that they understand what that difference is.
It is obvious with regards, people believe what they want to believe. And there are, I do think that there is very scripted and very and quite a bit of intentionality around convoluting the two to make one the other. And so that's why it's so important that we do have the distinction, so we do define what it is. And so there have been incidents where there has been some pushback with regard to being that we are teaching critical race theory, to which again we remind them of the fact that we are not. We try to explain to them the difference of the two. And so when they ask, when they challenge it, we just share with them what it is that we actually are teaching and looking at, the curriculum and making sure that we do have that diversity there. So again, for those people who want to be reasonable and understand, what it is happening, then they will understand the difference. And for those who choose to believe what they want to believe, then they're, critical race is this boogeyman, right? And so the people are chasing this thing that does not exist and making it something that it's not. And so, we have, we're having to deal with that. And of course, we all know, I'm not saying anything that's earth-shattering or new, but with the hybrid learning and hearing some things that we're, being able to see class at, in real time, making suggestions that of things that are not. And so we'll just continue to teach our culture responsive teaching, insist upon that as it's stated in our policy that, again, that we are meeting the needs of all students through culture responsive teaching, and just reiterating for those who keep asking, is critical race theory being taught? No, and we'll keep defining for them that is a way of thinking and not teaching.
And I want to thank you because your office is extremely responsive, and you in particular, and I'm so sorry that Dr. Gillens could not be here with us this evening. Ms. Sorry, I'd like to move to ask you a question as our representative of the board, in Arundel County's Public School Board. I was going to ask you what is the board's position on critical race theory, but I understand the policy, but as a student leader, what are the discussions between you and your peers? What do they sound like on the subject of critical race theory?
So I guess I'd have to separate to you when we talk about my peers. So my peers of color, when we talk about CRT, although it's not taught in our schools, anything that we know about CRT is something that we learn outside of school through our own academic adventures. It seems like getting answers to questions that we have. So when you think of many myths that are centered around race, and by virtue of that ended up being gender and sexuality, like the modern minority myth, we have a question. Why is it that, for example, I've heard, because I'm first generation Nigerian, I've heard teachers say in the past, why is it that Nigerian students are always so academically advanced compared to African American students? Which I always roll my eyes at, because a lot of times that myth, people feed into it and not recognize what it is, which is a lie. That, black students are just lazier or just aren't as smart as immigrant students. They feed into that myth because they don't have that background. And so my peers, because we're young and we don't necessarily like to take the first answer that we see in a history book, we go and explore. And so for that particular example, right, when we look at things like CRT, we get answers like many immigrants, not just Africans, many immigrants come in through what? An educational visa to study. So if your parents come here to study, if your parents come here aren't college educated, that's going to give you bounds and bounds of advances to your other peers, regardless of race, who might not have that benefit. That's an answer to a myth that many people feed into when they don't look beyond what they're taught in class. And so for my peers of color who are constantly hit with those myths to kind of dismantle them or to discredit them, CRT, at least how it's portrayed, how it's seen and what the education it can give us when we study it, it kind of answers those myths that are used against us. Now for my white peers, when we talk about CRT, or at least seeing history outside of how it's normally taught in schools, it's seen as unnecessary. It's seen as what is wrong with the way we were taught about Thomas Jefferson, what's seen as wrong about the way we were taught about slavery and Reconstruction. It's not seen as a way to validate the history that I have and the history that many people who are not white, who are not cisgender have in this country. And so that can make it a little hard in the classroom when we start arguing, which happens a lot in class, because what is being taught in class for us students of color sometimes feels lacking and leaves with more questions than answers in an educational setting. So the model minority myth, for those who don't know, is essentially I'm not going to call it a phenomenon because that is more of a positive connotation. It's basically this idea that immigrants who come into America, not Black Americans, not people who have been here for generations, but immigrants, so this is usually seen with Asian immigrants. Recently we see this with African immigrants. They come in and they are economically prosperous, they are academically impressive, and so when you shift and look at the Americans, and of course this is typically targeted at Black and Latino Americans, they're kind of shown to see what minorities like you are able to do, why aren't you able to do that? And it's that myth that kind of says, oh, Asians are just smarter, African immigrants are just smarter, or inversely, Black Americans are just lazier, they're not doing as much as their African counterparts, or they aren't working as hard, they aren't taking the benefits they have at their disposal, and they're too busy blaming other factors such as the white man or the system, instead of working hard to get where their other minorities have. And so it's a myth because if you look at history, if you look at the system, if you look at the things that are actually producing the results you see, you'll see there are many different obstacles that my friends who are African American, through their lineage, through their history, have faced that I, as a first generation American, may have not had to face through my own family line. But if you only look at it from a blanket, first shallow view, then you aren't going to get that answer. You're going to fall for the myth. And so that's something I've seen happen to my classmates, but it's something that through learning, through reading, through adventuring outside of school, outside of the curriculum we have, we've been able to get an answer to a question that would otherwise leave us, some of us, feeling inadequate and not knowing why.
Wow. That's all I can say. So one of the things that I gathered from what you're saying is the microaggressions that you receive. And it seems as though this model minority myth is somewhat falls into that space you talked about earlier, is this idea that when I was younger, I used to say, you're not like all the rest, right? And what does that mean? Like how many other, who is the rest, right? But thank you for that very awesome explanation. It was great. So I'm going to move now to Mr. Stephen White to ask you a question. So as a social activist, can you share some insights into why and how critical race theory is being weaponized? Again, insights into why and how it's being weaponized.
Okay. You're a great representative for the student population, and I've heard exactly what you said from my own children. My daughter's in the AP US History class, and her first day, she was able to recognize the disparity in how Christopher Columbus was discussed in her AP US History book. And so I definitely appreciate that. And I also appreciate the fact that you called out the fact that the teachers that are teaching you are not being trained in critical race theory either. And that's another aspect. I went to a teacher training. And so that's another aspect. I went through legal training. We were not trained on critical race theory in my legal training at the University of Baltimore. So it's that much of a minority in terms of the educational sphere that we find the weaponization of it to be so shocking for a lot of us. That this is such a random, minuscule aspect of our graduate school education, that, and even our undergraduate education, that using these terms, critical race and theory, into, we've turned them into what used to be Obamacare. So the Affordable Care Act was one thing, but we loved that, and then Obamacare came and we hated that. And so now critical race theory has now become the Obamacare of this past 2020 election, 2022. So it's being weaponized by white nationalists in the Republican Party in order to galvanize the voters that Trump has riled up, and given license to in order to feel comfortable being racist. And that began a long time ago, but in more recent years, with the publication of, following murder of George Floyd, following the murder, the creation of the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2014, there was a reckoning amongst younger white voters that became a separation between Fox News viewers, which are older, and younger white voters, which supported more diversity in their electoral positions by voting for Barack Obama. That weaponization has come from the publication of the 1619 Project. There's a book that Donald Trump created a commission to oppose the 1619 Project. How many of you all had heard about the year 1619 being the year that African Americans were introduced to the English colonies before the New York Times published that? How many of you all, raise your hand please if you have heard? Okay. Several, at least a good large percentage. We also have a member here. So it's within certain communities, it's very well known that 1619 was the year that Black people came to America in the English colonies. So the New York Times publication of Nicole Hannah-Jones' document was in those that she edited and wrote in as well. That publication was confronted by Donald Trump. He created a 1776 commission. And that commission published its own report on the founding of America. And it had its own ideology associated with it. And so, as the 1619 Project became a cause du jour online, certain actors within the National Republican Party and its various nonprofit organizations, the Koch brothers, etc., grasped onto an idea from a young man named Christopher Rufo, who sought to use critical race theory as the all-encompassing term for everything race-related. And for a race-related term that diversity, equity, and inclusion became a part of critical race theory. Affirmative action is a part of critical race theory. Any positive, anti-bias related program that addressed structural inequality became a polarizing force, and also was put under the banner of critical race theory. Just like we have death panels with Obamacare, we had all these various other ways that Obamacare was destroying America. Now you put those things in critical race theory, and you can see how this theme has developed. Another theme on the right is called cultural Marxism, and they believe that everything associated with any type of advancement by Latino people, African Americans, LGBTQ, etc., is a part of what they call cultural Marxism, and that they also tie critical race theory into a cultural Marxist analysis, and they muddy the two to say that critical race theorists are anti-capitalist, they're Marxists, and we can't, they try to shame critical race theory as a quote-unquote Marxist ideology. One of the areas that Dr. Royal talked about earlier was interest convergence in school desegregation cases. And the interest that converged for school desegregation in the late 50s was the fight against communism. And so that, and you all know, there's been a very broad and concerted campaign during the 50s to brand every leftist, quote unquote, as a communist. And until otherwise genteel white man confronted Senator McCarthy and said, do you have no, what was the statement? You all know.
Yeah, no shame.
Have you no shame? Have you no decency? Have you no decency? I think we're back at that moment. And so the question is, you know, we passed that moment where there is no decency, as we all witnessed in the January 6th hearing yesterday, that we have no decency, and it's been destroyed. And so that branding of Marxism has lasted since that time, since at least the 1950s. So prior to the 1950s, it was also a brand that was used to demean people, but since then, it's also been weaponized. So there's multiple weaponizations going on, but in this moment, we have critical race theory being used to, one, deflect from their own racism, and to deny racism, because this is something that is done, is what we call gaslighting, where you deny that you're even a racist. Donald Trump could never be racist. He's the least racist. You are the racist. That's the deflection and the denial in the same, like, two sentences. And then there's the demeaning, where we get you're too stupid to even figure out that what's good for you. I know what's good for you. We know what's best for you. And so there's deflection, denial, and the demonization. And then all of that can coalesce into violence, this level of political violence and genocidal violence that we've experienced over these past 2 years, at least, where we have a disparity in the impact of the coronavirus response that was in and of itself directed by the Trump administration and focused on a particular group of Trump voters, where you received the medicine that you needed, you received the ventilators that was necessary, and if you weren't in that group, then the vitriol of political antagonism was directed towards you. And you had paper towels thrown at you, and you didn't receive nearly as much response. So all of these aspects are things that I wanted to bring together in terms of how it's being weaponized in this moment as a method of denial, deflection, and inherent bias amongst a political minority, which has very strong media ties, and is also the first group that's usually listened to by their friends and family who don't really pay attention to politics. So they are the political voice for a lot of their network, and it's radicalized individuals to the point that they believe that there is a conspiracy against themselves, when, as we've witnessed, it's a deflection from their own conspiratorial activities.
And you raised something really interesting. I'd like to go back to a point that Ms. Onsori made earlier about the myths. And I'd like to ask of Dr. Royal the question, and this may be a rather lengthy response that you have, but it gets to the heart of it, about race, racism, and the connection to critical race theory. I mean, it's a really big piece, but if you can help us kind of understand the intersectionality there. I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Well, so race is a phenomenon.
Can you? Yes.
Race is a phenomenon that's very specific to one's context. So when I was 25, I got to spend some time in Brazil, right? So how race is, this is why people talk about it being a social construction. How race is understood in Brazil is very different from how it's understood in the United States. How race is lived out in different places in the world. So I also spent some time in Palestine, which very much, I'm gonna leave Palestine alone. But I, you know, there were things there that definitely felt like settler colonialism, right? So it's a racial project also. Now when you talk about racism, because race is a social construct based on one's location, one's context, so is the racism, right? So how racism looks, American racism is not necessarily the same as racism in another place. Interestingly, when I was a young woman in Morocco, pre-2001, right, so before September 11th, I was in college and went to Morocco. There was a certain way that Black Americans, in my experience, were treated in Morocco as opposed to Africans, darker Africans, right? So Black Americans, they were like, oh, do you know Michael Jackson? Do you know Oprah? Right? It was like, oh, you're a superstar, right? But darker Africans were not seen the same way as Black Americans, right? So that it looks different based on your context. Now, that connection to critical race theory, I would say it depends on your orientation to the world and your context. I was born here, right? I know it's fascinating me hearing about Anne Arundel County in Maryland because I'm a new Anne Arundel County resident. So I'm like, ooh, what's the tea? Find out what happened. But I'm a native Philadelphian, and so I know more about, Philadelphia. I am a child of the Great Migration, so both sides of my family come from North Carolina and South Carolina. Right. My understanding of race and racism comes very much from that context. It comes from a context of being educated in Christian school in the suburbs of Philadelphia, where there had been KKK rallies at the school just prior to my starting there, right? So our understanding of race and racism very much has to do with our entry point, right? There are some people who are asked, when did you learn? How did you find out that you were Black or that you were white? These sorts of things. So when you talk about critical race theory, it will for all of us, our understanding of race and racism will have a relationship to our introduction and how complex our understanding of race is and racism is. Do you follow me? Does that make sense?
Excellent, because I'm Creole, so I'm a hot mess, right? Yeah, race has always been an interesting conversation for us, and it's, people was, when you say you're Creole, what is that, right? And I said, well, it's a lot of things, right? So how do I begin? I'm Catholic, which is strange, right? And I was raised in that space, so it was always, like you say, the context is just very, very interesting. But thank you for answering that. Dr. Sami, as a sociologist and a scientist who studies social life, on a question in social change and the consequences of human behavior, can you share with the audience why society should either embrace or reject critical race theory?
Sure. So I think critical race theory was foundational in my PhD research. I am a proponent of critical race theory. I think it's a very useful tool. So I think it's going to be pretty clear that I'm going to say that society should embrace critical race theory, because I think I would be dismayed and saddened to live in a society that did not want to try to understand the inequalities that continue to exist in order to try to remedy those inequalities. Do we not want to try to better understand what people's lived experiences are with regard to racism, and gender and sexuality and everything, or do we not want to improve on ourselves? I think that by rejecting critical race theory, where some folks are trying to bury their heads in the sand and pretend that everything is a-okay when we know that it's not. We have people who are being murdered by police because of racial bias. We have people who are not, who are losing their jobs because of racial bias. We have people who don't have the same amount of money, in their everyday lives because of the color of their skin. Do we not want to try to understand those things to make sure that everybody has more equal footing in our society? I believe we do. We should and we do need to understand these things. And I also think we need to step away. We need to kind of say no more false, fake news. And I think that this debate, Stephen, you mentioned how it's a distraction, it's a deflection. I think it very much serves those purposes of distracting us from the real issues and where, the whole mess that everything has been in the last little while. And so I would say that I think that critical race theory is a way for us to say, no, we have a history, we have a situation, we have arrived to this point in 2022 through a very specific path. And it's not just to demonize white people, it's not just to make little kids feel bad or say you're to blame, but it's so that we can move forward. I think that denying history and denying the reality of today is dangerous. So I think that I am an advocate for critical race theory as a tool for understanding our world. And also, I think that I'm an advocate for these debates and kind of talking about critical race theory because I'm scared of what's happening where we are banning books, we are saying this can't be taught, that you can't say gay, you can't say this. This is scary, and like you mentioned the McCarthy era, and it's really problematic that a country that purports itself to be one of freedom and free speech and all these things is trying to silence people who are asking for equality and people who want to learn basic facts about history. I think that's very problematic and very scary, and we should be concerned about where this is going.
Thank you, Dr. Tommy. That's wonderful. So advocating and accepting, specifically to embrace critical race theory. And what I heard from you was, very much what I feel, feeling somewhat oppressed by kind of more the recent happenings and fearful. And also looking for ways in which we can have great, productive dialogue around real issues that people don't fear and continue to reject reality. I do have a question for Dr. Hughes. Dr. Hughes, how can we as a society, especially those without, who support advocating equity, including social, political, economic, etc., constructively advocate the kind of change that is inclusive of an accurate narrative of history, one that is truthful and that reflects the contributions, ugly and pretty, of all Americans?
Well, the purpose of education is make sure that we do have a learned citizenry so that they can make good decisions. And so in our role as educators, we're making sure that we are teaching, we're teaching kids to think, not what to think, but we're teaching them to think. And so when the fake news comes, and we know it's there, that they're able to very critically analyze it to determine its validity or lack thereof, and to challenge the notion that there is one way of thinking. And so I think it's important that we continue to do that. This year, as a part of the early professional development days that all schools participate in, we have 4 days that are set aside for Equity PD, once a quarter, in which we, this past year, have been using Zaretta Hammond's culture responsive teaching in the brain. And one of the things that we impress upon our teachers, all teachers, to make sure that there is a proper degree of academic rigor in teaching the students. Why? Because it is able to, again, help kids, teach them how to think, right? And we, even in that professional development, and a part of Hammond's work is she talks about the physiology of the brain and how when we are challenging students and helping them to think more deeply, much more critically, how the dendrites, within the brain, have just a little bit more depth. So I think it's important that we just continue to make sure that we are teaching, the vast, with a vast degree of a difference within the text. So, I too am concerned about when we hear about banning books, and banning certain content and not challenging it. And so I think with the beginning of the 1619 Project and some of these other things, it has given rise to people to teach the true history. And it's not a matter of being woke, it's a matter of we need to know the truth about the history. And so as we're challenging that, and one of the work that our office is doing is that we are collaborating with the Office of Curriculum and Instruction, and we are looking and we're scrubbing the curriculum. And we're looking at and making sure that we are most equitable and making sure that we are culture responsive. And so when we see curriculum, things that are in curriculum, be it either in the actual curriculum or in resources that support the curriculum, that does anything other than create culture responsiveness, then we are having some conversations about it and we are replacing that. And I think it's important for that to happen at all levels, not just at the K-12 level, but also at the university level as well. And one of the things that I do think that our esteemed partners in the institutions of higher education is, in the teacher prep programs that we are doing, that we're doing that at that level as well. So they come to the classroom ready to begin to have that conversation, all right? And we have to make sure that we do not succumb to these distractions, and when people are beginning to make noise and try to shut people down, because you all watch the same news that I watch, right? You all seen the same board meetings that I've seen where board members have been intimidated, where superintendents have had to hire security, all in an effort to shut down, the teaching of things. Why? Because hey, we have kids as a result of that. We have, in addition to the professional developments that we have once a quarter, a part of that is Unity Day, and we have been talking about the social justice standards, through learning for justice, and it talks and in the social justice standards it talks about the importance of 1, identity, 2, diversity, and action and justice, right? And so as a result of this, we have had our students who have realized that some of the things that they're being taught at home needs to be challenged, right? Bowie was a part of a group of students who actually led a book study with some of our middle schoolers and talked about this book is anti-racist. And so it's, it was a great, I thought it was good. I was not able to be on all of the sessions, but it was good to see some parents there with their kids and kids coming home. And it's not a matter, because, I heard it mentioned here tonight, and one of the things we hear about is that, my kid is coming home and you're making white kids feel bad and all that. No one is trying to make anyone feel bad, right? We're just displaying the history. But when they do hear and they're hearing about the importance of diversity, and everybody can't look like me and everybody cannot be the same. That's not an accurate depiction of our world. When they talk about, identity and who am I as I show up, and more than just the superficial culture, and you're just looking at me and seeing that I'm a black man, what is the deep culture about, with me? And not only me, but everyone in this room who have their uniqueness and their identity showing up. Talking about justice, what is fair? All right? And so when kids read stories, and they understand that, well, why is this happening to so-and-so? And this didn't happen to so-and-so, and beginning to challenge that. But most of all, the last part of those social justice standards is talking about action. What am I going to do about it? when I turn on the television and I see that people are being shot down and killed because of the color of their skin, or because who they choose to love, then I need to do something about that. And so then I need to harken back to what I've learned in those civics lessons, and I need to talk to and challenge those laws, those policies that are in place. And so we've got to continue to make sure that we're teaching the true history. And because again, our kids are our future, and I think that's why there is this angst that has been that exists, because as the true history, the insistence on true history being taught, and upsetting the status quo and challenging the structural racism that exists. Again, nobody wants to give up what they have. And, as Dr. Royal talked about, wait a minute, what's in this for me? And is this challenging my status and where I am? And if that's the case, then I need to go after that. So we need to continue to teach our kids two things. Not tell you what to think, but teach you to think so you can challenge things when things come at you and there's no validity. So I think that's what we need to do. Continue doing it.
Can I follow?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So I listened to you say an accurate narrative of history, and we, in the same way scientists are constantly sort of debating about what exists, right? Historians do the same thing, right? So when we talk about having an accurate narrative of history, again, it depends on your orientation and perspective, and it always will. When we're thinking about what's happening in our classrooms, part of the concern for people like me is there are some people who say we shouldn't teach about difference at all, and then there are others who are teaching about difference in ways that reinforce problematic notions. So, for instance, when we're teaching about something, the idea of perspective taking, if you're teaching about the era that is slavery in this country, there's a great book called Reading, Writing, and Racism that looks at the ways racism is perpetuated in school curriculum. And here's what I mean. When students are asked to take the perspective of perhaps a slave catcher, write an ad as if you would catch a slave, or develop a punishment for slaves who ran away. Whose perspectives are students being asked to take, right? Who's being sort of held up as important? Who's being ignored? Whose perspective? There's not enough activities asking students, why would someone actually flee? Why would they leave, right? So it gets to be the accurate thing is going to depend a lot on one's perception and one's orientation to that history.
And as we're looking at curriculum, to do that, because Dr. Roy makes great points. One of the things a resource that we use is the MADE Equity Card, MADE Maryland Association of Boards of Education, and it asks 5 questions. And the first question is, who are the underrepresented groups affected by this policy, program, practice, decision, or action? What are the potential impacts on these groups? The second question, does this policy, program, practice, decision, or action worsen existing disparities or produce other unintended consequences? Question 3, how have you intentionally involved stakeholders who are also members of the community affected by this policy, program, practice, decision, or action? Can you validate your assessment in the first 2 questions that were asked, having considered this stakeholder's reaction? Question 4, what are the barriers to more equitable outcomes? Mandated, political, emotional, financial, programmatic, or managerial? And the 5th question is, how would you mitigate the negative impacts and address the barriers identified above? And so one of the things, this is one of the resources that we give to schools, departments, offices, as they're looking at things. It could be a matter of how are we spending our budget? I mean, and are we giving it to all type of vendors? Who are we hiring? How are we making sure that we get the most diversity, most talented persons? And as we're looking at curriculum resources and what's in the curriculum. So those are some of the things that we look at, again, to help with that.
Can I follow real quick?
Real quick,
Just
because I want
on
to make
Dr.
sure,
Royal's
I'm sorry,
statement
here's our
about,
last question, yes.
or Dr. Royal's statement about the perspective taking and creating an ad as a slave catcher. My daughter, in 2019, had to create an ad attracting Europeans to come to America. And that during the colonial times. And so we had to have a discussion about that. You know, it was a discussion of, you know, who you're attracting Europeans, you know. As a young black woman, you know, would you even be tasked with creating that ad in 1730 to do that activity? And then it went on from there in terms of, you know, what religious persecution are they trying to flee? How did African Americans experience religious persecution during slavery? And, you know, were they able to carry on Muslim lifestyles and Muslim ideas under slavery? And so we had that discussion about at home, but it did not carry into the classroom. And that was in Anne Arundel County schools. And I'm saying this is something that I experience almost daily from elementary, middle, and high school. And so when I hear about the idea that there's some sort of mass conspiracy against what's the status quo is being taught. Right now, the status quo is being taught in Anne Arundel County schools. The reproduction of workers who will be with Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin is, you know, who will work for the federal government, likely in defense. That's what is the current reproduction that we're receiving in Anne Arundel County schools. People who will be either ignored and then decide to choose the military as a career option, or people who are encouraged to join the military in the Naval Academy as a career option. And so they are given a perspective to take into those careers, or they're given a identity, or their identity is placed on them regarding what role they can play in society. And I think you can see it in your own children, is what I'm trying to say, is that, you know, you can see it if you're really culturally aware of what's happening in this county and how
What
it
you're
works.
saying is you have to be engaged. I really appreciate, Dr. Hughes, what you were saying earlier, you and Dr. Rowe, when you talked about the accurate context. It sounds like what you all were saying is that context is everything. And I think it's really important that I give the last question. We have about 5 minutes to Ms. Almasori, and I want to ask you, with that as context, everything you've just heard, what's happening in schools and development of curriculum and with teachers, from your interaction with your peers who don't necessarily agree with critical race theory, or those who believe that racism doesn't exist, you know, that negating of your reality. Do you believe that social justice and equity are possibly being damaged by forcing the conversation of race and racism?
So, and I think we've already touched about this earlier in the panel, you can't force a conversation about race or racism when it's part of your daily life. You can't force something that is there every minute and every hour, whether you are conscious of it or not. And I think the idea or the feeling for some who don't want to have this conversation that it's being forced down their throat is a symptom of, one, not responsibly having these conversations earlier in life about what race is, what it is not, and by the virtue of that, what racism is and what it is not. But two, and this is, I guess I'll call it a pet peeve that I have, is about the reasoning we give to white children and who grow up to become white adults about why we have to talk about race. Even on this panel, we've talked about how we need to have this type of curriculum because we need students who look like me, who are minorities, to see themselves in the things they're learning. But, you know, the way our education is made is not just so that I can see a black character who isn't enslaved. You need to have diversity. You need to talk about race because, you know, one day if I have a white doctor who doesn't know what a certain disease, how it comes up, and how it appears in black patients, that's between me living and me dying. If I have a nurse who was taught in nursing school that African American mothers have a higher pain tolerance than any other race, that's between me and my child's life. If I have a son who has ADHD, but the doctor that I'm going to doesn't know what that looks like in African Americans, what those symptoms look like, because the only people they've ever studied were white males at a certain age, that affects diagnosis. It's things like that where, yes, it's great to be represented, and I love being represented in my curriculum and the stories I read and the things I'm taught, but it's not only for the benefit of those students of color, of those students in the LGBTQ community. It's for the benefit of white, cisgender, straight students as well. Because if they're operating through life only thinking that it's the way that they navigate through it, then they're going to make many, many missteps in how they vote and how they interact with people who don't live life the same way they do. And it's going to affect me in a cycle interacting with them in the community that we have to share. And so I would say to my peers who feel like racism is being stuffed down their throat and that those conversations aren't necessary, that for you, it may not feel necessary because you have the benefit of navigating life outside of race. I think that's how I would describe whiteness, and that's how I thought about it throughout high school. If you are white, you live life outside of being tagged by race. But me as a black person, and I'm not even going to get into being a black woman, a black Christian, the daughter of immigrants, just being black, that will always, before anything else about me, will be the first thing that's named. Bumi's not just a woman, she's a black woman. Bumi's not just a student, she's a black student. And so having that shadow constantly, and I don't see it as a bad thing, but constantly tagging me wherever I go, that's absent in whiteness. And if you don't think about race like that, because you don't have to, that's going to affect not only how you navigate the world with me, but with your other white counterparts. Because you don't have to think about race. You don't have to think about what that means. And that's why we need to have the conversations. Because until we do, we're going to keep on making those missteps.
Thank you so much. So this is the first portion of the forum. We're going to take a few minutes to break. I'm going to go over the questions, and then we'll start taking the questions from the audience. So how much time do you? Okay, so we have and we also have statements. So I'm going to do my absolute best to go through the questions, and in some cases assign them to certain people. And others, I don't know how to answer some of these with your statements. So I will apologize in advance. We'll do our absolute best to get to as many of these as we possibly can. We said 35 to 40 minutes. And so we'll do our absolute best to stick to that so that we're out by 8:15. Okay? So I'll start with this first. This has been great. Can we have more of these discussions? Thank you. Can Dr. Royal explain whiteness as property and possibly role play with the mediator an example of what that looks like? Well, first of all, I'll ask Dr. Royal if she can explain what whiteness as property is. I am not prepared to role play with the mediator, so I try to stay neutral. So my job here today is to moderate, not to role play. Okay. Dr. Royal, can you explain what whiteness as property is?
Can I? Sure, but part of the reason why I suggested the article is because I think that she does a better job than I could do on the spot of explaining it. So I'll say again, her name is Cheryl Harris, Cheryl Harris. It's a Harvard Law Review article. I can't remember what year she published it. And honestly, I don't want to do it a disservice explaining this particular tenet.
Can I give a little bit?
Sure.
Just briefly, whiteness as property describes, it describes how the legal field and law is from time, it's very well footnoted, I'll put it that way. So she discusses, for one example, she discusses how race, and blackness in specific, has been devalued. And white people could sue to have their whiteness established in order to increase the value of their name and their reputation. So name and reputation is associated with whiteness and blackness. And it's a carryover, and it's also associated with royalty. And so it's in your nobility. And so it's a carryover from British common law that Dr. Harris describes very eloquently and thoroughly how whiteness can be used to achieve a certain social capital that increases with that race. We see it most specifically in housing, and how everything associated with blackness devalues a house, and as a real estate agent, and everything associated with whiteness increases the value of the house, whether it's, and you can see it in Savannah Park in and of itself, where you have single family detached homes. There are no multi-family homes in that neighborhood serving that school cluster. So, and that's something that Dr. Arlotto has told me, or told groups of us. So, housing-wise is where we see the value of whiteness most specifically, and it's also the number one wealth generator in America. It's generally run by small businesses, and most real estate brokerages are small businesses, family-owned, and very closed. And so it's a closed network. Also, your employment network is valued by your proximity to whiteness. So all of those aspects, those are just two aspects. I think Boone talked about whiteness in terms of health, and how a black woman with a blood clot who is less valuable, especially for a nonprofit healthcare administrator to save, as opposed to a white woman whose health insurance may be better. And so just in and of that, those aspects, and then Dr. Harris's whiteness as property could be extended into other areas of intersectionality that Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw discussed, where we would see a lack of protections for LGBTQ communities. When I was working with the ACLU, we attempted to pass the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and we failed at the time because the House Republicans would not allow us to do it. But that would have extended employment protections for people despite their sexual orientation.
So thank you for that answer. I think it's important. The Anne Arundel County has a very valuable tool that we use every year. It's called the Poverty Amongst Plenty. It's the Anne Arundel County Assessment. And some of the things that you're talking about, the disproportionality that you will see, there's an organization called REI, Racial Equity Institute, and each year they put on thing called Groundwater. If you've not had an opportunity to participate, you should. It is absolutely enlightening when you look at the data. Dr. Royal, the person who asked the question also wanted to know what grade you teach.
So I don't teach a grade. I teach at Loyola University, Maryland, in the School of Education. I teach both undergraduates and graduate students. I will not be teaching this year as I am on sabbatical. But I teach intro to education, race, class, and gender in education, politics of school reform, foundations of education, power, identity, and intersectionalities in education. There is one thing that I remembered from Cheryl Harris's Whiteness is Property. And I want to point out that she's sort of articulating this historical walk, okay? But there's this interesting phenomenon that she talks about called the right to exclude. The right to exclude. So who gets included in certain benefits And who do we have a right to exclude from certain benefits? I can't talk about how y'all arrange your schools in Anne Arundel County because I honestly don't know. But I can tell you where I come from. In Philadelphia, I graduated from one of the oldest public high schools in the country, Central High School, founded in 1836. Used to be all men until 1984. Okay, very prestigious. At least we think so. We were graduates. Central has this thing about exclusion, right? And not just Central High School, but Philadelphia, our school system is stratified. That means people have to apply to get into certain high schools. So when I went to college in North Carolina, people were like, well, why did you have to do the college application process at 12 years old? Why did you have to apply for high school? But that's how things had been, right? I traveled an hour from my end of the city to the other end of the city to get to this special admission college preparatory high school. So the question becomes, who does Central, for example, have the right to exclude, right? Historically, it was based on gender and race. Then it became based on worthiness, right? And people determined worthiness by grades or by test scores. But what happens when you've been relegated to schools where you aren't even exposed to certain types of curricula, where you aren't exposed to algebra or foreign language classes, right? That means you haven't really had an opportunity to compete or be prepared to compete. But you're also being excluded from access to this sort of college prep special admission school. So that's an example of the type of thing Cheryl Harris talks about in Whiteness is Property. Just one example. I really do recommend you go and read the article for yourself.
Thank you. Another question is this session being filmed and will it be available online? I think Arundel TV, shout out to Arundel TV. They are filming and this will be available via YouTube on Arundel TV. With a number of questions talking about CRT being taught in school, and so the question that you answered a moment ago, Dr. Waddle, about the grade that you teach, I think there may still be some misunderstanding about critical race theory being taught in public schools in Anne Arundel County. So the question is, the panel has said CRT isn't being taught in AACPS schools. Will it be introduced next school term in September? First question. Which grades? Second question. In which courses? English, history. I think that best question goes to you, Dr. Hughes.
Earlier in this evening, you asked the question, does Anne Arundel County Public Schools teach critical race theory? My answer was no then. There have been no curriculum changes since we started this panel. So there is no teaching of critical race theory in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. It's not going to be taught in the elementary level. It's not going to be taught in the middle school level. It won't even be taught in high school. And it won't be taught in either of the content areas. And what was the second question?
Okay, so the second question is, please explain ESL, emotional social learning. Is it being explained and included in AACPS, and at what grades?
Social and emotional learning. So social and emotional learning is understanding where students are with regard to their emotional state, all right, how they interact with one another. And so, developing relationships with students, getting to know the students, getting to know about their cultural backgrounds, being able to speak to those things, trying to lessen any type of anxiety that exists as a result of education. That's not a way of really teaching anything. It's really doing things. We connect with kids and we get to, that we connect with them. The mirrors and the windows that I talked about in the curriculum, where they begin to see themselves, see others. We develop relationships with them. Hey, Boomy, how you doing? I saw you at the volleyball game last night. The winning spike that you did, that was great. Oh, Boomy, I hear that the fact that I make this personal connection with her, all right, that I, in the hallway, I see her. I know some things about her, and that goes with all the students. So because Boomy knows that she has an adult in the building that she can connect with, that she can talk to, who knows her beyond just being a student, she's going to probably feel a little bit better about coming to school because she is seen as an individual. And so that's social, that speaks to social and emotional learning. That's not something really that you can teach. I'm quite sure you've seen those videos where teachers meet students at the door and they have their handshakes and bumps and all that other stuff. That's to build relationships, right? So that when the student has come in contact with some content that's difficult, that they don't shut down, right? It's like, oh, Dr. Hughes, I don't understand this, and they feel okay to do that, right? Because I've built that rapport with them, all right? They know that I am committed to them and their success. All of that speaks to social and emotional learning because I've lessened the anxiety. The student understands that when they reach content that is a little bit too rigorous for them, that I'm going to help them through it, all right? I'm going to engage with them to make sure that they have productive struggle. Why? Because we can't love kids into failure and just give them easy stuff, but we need to let them know that when we raise the degree of cognitive demand with regard to the content that we're teaching, that we're going to scaffold support and make sure that we're committed to their success, and we're going to demonstrate that. All of that I just explained speaks to social and emotional learning, all right? Because I'm culturally responsive to them, meeting them where they are, all right? Letting them know that I care about them. I'm building a positive relationship with them, all right? They might know a little something about me. I have a son who lives in New York. So that exchange, that all speaks to that, okay? So that's the explanation for that. And let me just say again, we don't teach critical race theory in Anne Arundel County Public Schools.
I got a follow-up, but I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Zaki speak.
Thank you. I just want to add, I think the confusion around critical race theory is that it is everywhere. It is being taught in our schools, that kids are being taught critical race theory. Critical race theory is really only mainly taught, like somebody mentioned, like in grad school, maybe a very specific course. It's not something that kids are going to be taught in schools in grade 5 or even in middle school, high school. I only ever encountered it when I was in my PhD program, and most people encounter it in grad school. So I think that part of the reason why it's so good we're having this discussion tonight is because it's really important to unpack and the debates and the misrepresentations about critical race theory that are out there. So that's one thing that I want to mention. And also just to clarify, I mentioned earlier history and you all mentioned accurate narratives. There has been a move towards talking about history, broadening the perspectives in history, and that's also a reflection of calls in post, kind of in 2020 with the social unrest, the Black Lives Matter protests, people wanting to learn about racism and have that training. That's where there has been an increasing interest in understanding more the history and all that, but that's not critical race theory. So there's kind of two separate things that are happening, but they're being lumped together as one big thing and all of the same.
Thank you. So to follow up, Dr. Hughes, a lot of the questions seem to be focused in the public school system, and that's why I'm asking the questions of Dr. Hughes, but of course anyone can jump in. How long has the school system been teaching equity? Has it changed to become CRT?
Equity is not something that is taught. It too is more so of a way of thinking. I've been in the district since 2018, and so since 2018, I do know, I can't remember the first year it happened, but I do know that the school district has set aside 1 day a quarter for half a day professional development in which we teach various topics with regard to equity, building relationships, culture responsive teaching, differentiated pedagogical strategies, all right? That's the science of learning and the art of learning and how teaching to be more effective to meet the needs of the student. So we've been doing equity professional development, but equity should be, the idea is that equity should be braided within everything, all right? Equity is not an extra thing, all right? It's a way of being with regard to that. As I see things, I'm seeing things through different lenses, all right? How would I see this? How would I interact with this if I were a white man who was cisgendered, all right, but is an immigrant to this country, right? So it's helping, it's a way of thinking with regard to that.
You read the equity analysis, I believe, earlier. It was the 5 questions that you had.
Yes.
And they were not specifically related to race necessarily. They were a series of questions to engage students in regards to that. Is that true?
That is correct. Because again, when you think about individuals, when you think about us, all of us sitting here or standing and our identities, it's multidimensional. Instead of 2 sides of a coin, think of it as a diamond, right? And it's very multifaceted. And so that's why those questions speak to that, because there can be various differences. Typically, we always go, when we talk about diversity and equity, everybody wants to go to race, all right? But we have students who are differently abled, all right? For a student who is physically challenged, that cut in the sidewalk makes a difference. But having that cut in the sidewalk helps people who are not physically challenged, right? Because if I have a sore knee, I don't want, or if I'm carrying something, if I'm carrying a wagon, it helps everyone. And the idea with regard to equity and culturally responsive teaching, the other CRT, is so that we are honoring everyone. I don't care whether you're white, you're black, you're physically challenged, you're not physically challenged, your sexual orientation. Again, it's speaking to you and making sure that we are addressing you. All right?
It was interesting, as soon as you said that, I thought about the cut in the sidewalk, it's up ever so many steps, and being blind or visually impaired, and how those spaces allow a person to mark physically where they are. It never really hit me that way before. As our population gets younger, is it important that all students learn critical thinking? And will this improve Maryland's position in the U.S. and or in the world?
Personally, I think every person should prioritize being able to critically think. You don't need to be a young student, though I do believe it should start young. Personally, when I think of the future, especially growing up, I could say this is the most civil unrest I've ever seen, but I'm 18, so I haven't seen that much. But every generation, they have their issues with race, they have their issues in politics, and I think what we see right now, though it's new to history, things like the January 6th insurrection, things like the changes in our political parties, so that's new, or I don't know if I'd call it new. Like the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I think that's the rhymes that we're looking at right now. And so the difference for people who are my age, who are younger, or who are even a little bit older, the critical thinking, I think, is what gives us a new history we're making, is to learn how to see the news differently, to engage with our political leaders differently. That's what's going to make history not rhyme anymore. It's going to make it completely new. And I think starting from a young age is best, but I don't believe that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And so any person can learn how to navigate our growing modern world in a critical way, but it's best to start when you're young.
So interesting you said that, because there was a dialogue earlier about older people. And of course, when you get to a certain age, you start to lose your thoughts. When you're in the middle of saying something, I was thinking about something. And you said something earlier that made me think about the context in which many of us are raised, like the generations. And I was taught not to question. And many of you have probably heard this, children are seen and not heard, right? In your generation, you have a very different context in that my 14-year-old daughter is here, she's in the back, and she questions me all the time. Bev, you know this, you've been in meetings. She is asking questions all the time, and I'm thinking, I don't want to say because I said so. Because I want her to think and ask questions. I want her to be thoughtful. But your generation, I think the difference is that you have a privilege of having people that are more tolerant of allowing for that space. And so I'm just excited to see that education, we're challenging our peers, we're challenging each other in various contexts. So with that being said, earlier, Dr. Roll, you talked about Derek Bell. And so there's a question that someone asks, says Derek Bell came to second thoughts about the path to desegregation. Do you agree? And the second part of that is, with segregation in schools still rampant, where do we go from here?
I mean, you know, so this is, I don't see, if we're going to talk about school segregation, right, there's a difference. Derek Bell, and if we think about like Brown v. Board, right, the issue was state-enforced segregation, okay? So someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones is actually a big proponent of things like busing and all this for school desegregation. You know, that's not me. So I just, quite honestly, like I'm HBCU educated. I chose to attend a historically black college. I'm glad I did. It was a wonderful experience. I would do it again, even though I teach at what's called a PWI, a predominantly white institution, right? Some people see that as segregation. I don't. I had a beautiful experience. I got a wonderful education there that prepared me for Johns Hopkins, right? So I'm not really sure how to answer the question about segregation. My concern would be about state-enforced segregation. My concern is for a government to determine who has the right to attend certain schools and who has to exclude. That would be my concern. But people choosing the education that they think makes the most sense for them, that I'm totally with. So I'm not sure how to respond to that question. And in terms of Derek Bell, from what I remember, because I haven't opened my Derek Bell stuff in a minute, but he felt like, Martin Luther King at the end of his life was saying, I fear that we've integrated my people into a burning house, right? Derek Bell was kind of like, we've done all this work to desegregate these schools, and then people still find ways to underserve our children in these desegregated schools. And so in that way, I agree with him. It is less my concern of how desegregated a school is. It is more my concern about the resources that are provided to students at the schools, and also who is separating students, right? Have students sort of self-selected into different groups, or is it something that's being imposed on them by their educators or by their government? That is what I would have a big problem with.
Can I say one thing in regards to where we are now? Because I know yesterday we had a big Supreme Court decision related to the funding of religious schools. And that has been a major concern in regards to resegregation of black communities and white communities and whatnot. So because many religious schools sprung up in the wake of Brown v. Board that were used as segregation academies. And so segregation academies became a tool for segregationists and white nationalists to, one, teach white nationalism, and two, build their own self-segregated communities that had the idea that, much like that, whiteness is godly, and God is white, Jesus is white, And this land, this virgin land that did not contain anybody here before white people got here, was here for the white man to take over. And that level of white nationalism has become a Christian nationalist ideology. And so it spreads as white Christian nationalism, and any threat to America from non-whites, from countries that may be perceived, this is where I think we were talking about Palestine a little bit earlier, and colonialism, is where a threat to America from a non-white country was perceived as a threat to whiteness. And so that threat must be met with force. That threat must be met with coercion, economic coercion. That threat must be met with all the tools that the British used to spread their colonialism across the world. And America has become the foundational marketer of that ideology. Anyway, that is in segregation academies. And in the 70s, following a Supreme Court decision, it was banned. The state-sponsored funding of desegregation academies was banned. It was under, I know some attorneys are in here. I'm trying to remember the name specifically of the pastor who was the segregationist that brought this about. But right now, our Supreme Court majority is of the belief that segregation academies are legitimate and they deserve state funding. And so that's a concern that we, as well, people of goodwill, hopefully in this room, will have the opportunity to either address within our own communities or within the larger Maryland community as well.
So I'm going to read a couple of statements, and thank you, Mr. Wadi. And these are more, again, we can. I don't know that there's an answer to these, but I do want to make sure that we are fair to everyone. It says CRT. You all are up in the panel saying that CRT does not exist and it is not being taught in schools. We're saying that it's not being taught in public schools.
I teach it.
Right.
In my class.
Right.
I don't work for Anne Arundel County Schools, though.
Right, but you teach at the university
I
level.
do.
Okay.
Loyola University, Maryland.
Right. And yet you are not specialists in from schools, etc. Okay. I do not see color or race in anyone up there except what you all say you are. I have interracial family members. We are all created equal under God. This is so very true.
My great-grandmother was a white woman, so there you go. Diversity.
Diversity. You're diverse. How does fatherless homes help African Americans? I don't know. Please consider Black History 365 as a curriculum. Dr. Salmi, as a sociologist, this is a two-part question, it's kind of long. What is it about human nature that throughout history in every society, it seems there is a pecking order where someone is on the top and someone else, in parentheses it says for other reasons of race, sex, whatever, is on the bottom, question mark. What is it about human nature that makes that happen? Question number one. Question number two, what do you do with the fact that people are not interested in understanding the lived experience of people who are not like them? Is this a facet of the pecking order?
Those are good questions. Thank you. I think, we do hear that, yes, it's normal. Everybody's racist. Everybody's afraid of somebody. So we have hierarchies, and it's true that hierarchy is part of maybe human nature. But what sociologists are interested in is, kind of the social forces that reinforce or created those hierarchies. And so one has to wonder why we create hierarchies and who benefits from hierarchies. I don't know definitively what it is about human nature that makes us categorize people. But I think that it's also important to mention that, while it's common to have hierarchies, those hierarchies based on race, it's a very modern idea. So differences and creating that ranking of people based on their very nature only happened in the 1600s. If you look at the studies of race scholars. So it's not to say that differences didn't exist before, but differences based on the hierarchy according to people's supposed race and skin color and so on is actually quite recent. So that's something I want to mention. And lived experience, why do people might not want to hear about lived experience? I personally think it makes people uncomfortable. I think that when you are encountering people's stories and hearing about what they go through, it forces you to step outside of yourself and maybe outside of that neutrality that you perhaps might have been living. And then kind of, it's booming, right? What you were saying earlier about that, Mark, how people of color may feel like they are marked is because of their lived experience. And so I don't have the answers to how we make people maybe want to hear those stories, but I think exposure is one big thing, right? Maybe just having non-segregated, desegregated environments and being able to hear from diverse voices allows people to be kind of brought into these different lived experiences. And one thing that I'm working on at my college is, for example, decolonizing higher education, and part of that work involves thinking about whose voices I use in my classroom, whose writings or whose not just writings but videos, blogs, podcasts, whose voices are being put out there. So if people don't want to engage with others and their lived experience, perhaps we need to think about avenues for encouraging or just making it the norm, right? Kind of sharing lived experience as our new normal.
Thank you. As you were talking, I thought about the historian George Matthew Frederickson and his work on racism. I don't know if you've read his book. And he talks about raza, which is the origin of race, which is talking about specifically a word that was used to delineate animals, like when you breed animals and how we've adopted the word. And I forget the year, it was around the 1600s when that was brought in to talk about people and how that's been conflated. And I thought it was a really interesting, it's a great book. It's a very short read. If you get an opportunity to read it, it's called Racism by George Matthew Frederickson. It's an amazing book on race. It goes all the way back to the 9th century and how intersectionality, Dr. Royale, which is interesting, religion, and those sorts of things were kind of brought into that concept. We don't have a lot more time to talk. We could probably go on forever and ever. And I have a series of questions that are still up here. I don't know how you want me to handle this. If you want to just close it down and say thank you to the audience, but we probably have another, I'd say, 20 questions. So, yeah.
We can go until 8:45.
Okay, so let me throw a couple more questions out. Right. So the next question is, as you're aware, systematic barriers affecting Latino students can be conceptualized as inequalities and obstacles that restrict and limit access to educational achievement. the University of Maryland school system, I think it's school system, enforced the COVID vax as a requirement for campus learning. As you may know, Latino students are least likely to enroll and graduate from universities. Latinos are also least likely to get the COVID vax. With this CRT framework, do you concur that this academic institution perpetuated racial inequalities amongst this group, Latinos? Anyone want university professors, would you like to tackle this one? There may not be an answer. And let me say this, we don't have all of the answers, but if we'd like to tackle that. Okay, if you don't have an answer, we'll move on.
The question sounds disingenuous. It sounds like a disingenuous question, first of all, because it is attempted to use an oppressed group to justify a prior belief regarding their exposure and ability to receive vaccinations on facts that we don't have presented before us. And so in undermining the idea that critical race theory and that there was some sort of critical race theory analysis in that question, the premise of it did not contain what it is that we would consider to be an analysis associated with critical race theory. It did use race. There was some sort of theory that had various aspects of evidence associated with it, but in the way that it was written, the description of it, I couldn't find a answer related to what a critical race theorist would identify as the answer. So also, we may have
Yeah, we may have some issues with microphones. So with that being said, in critical race theory, what is the most important attribute of a person? Again, we may or may not have answers to the question. So I asked the question. We'll move on. Since critical race is a theory, and I like this one, what are alternatives to this theory? That's one part of the question. What thresholds are used to define inequity as structurally racist versus single or isolated instances of injustice? Perhaps a clear math-based definition would help to remove emotional reactions. Should I ask the question again?
No.
It's a two-part question. Okay.
Yeah. So, no. A math-based, no. So there's a great, again, theorist, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who talks about the problem of trying to solve social issues with mathematical equations, right? Especially depending on the composition of a particular area. So when we think about something like school desegregation, if you want to desegregate a school, this is where people get into at what threshold is a school officially desegregated, right? How many people have to be there? How many different types of people? What percentages? But then, if you don't have enough sort of racial diversity, then you can never achieve that mathematical balance. Now, the first part of that question asks about, are there other theories to explain race? I think that is a wonderful question, and the simple answer is yes. There are lots of other theories to explain issues around race. There's a great researcher in California, Zeus Leonardo, who wrote a book called Racial Frameworks that takes up different, Zeus Leonardo, takes up different sort of ideas about race and racism that are different from critical race theory. So not everybody who studies race and racism is a critical race theorist. There are lots of different theories that look at differences around race. Zeus Leonardo is just one example of that. Okay.
Thank you. Is Marxism superior to capitalism? I guess it depends on your perspective. I'm going to answer that one. Can anyone on the panel give an opinion on the collapse of the family in America in all races and creeds? And how has this affected relationships between the races and dialogue?
No, I think because that's, I don't know. Can I just say something about the other question about the math?
Absolutely.
I think like, yes, we can't quantify, but I think sometimes it's helpful for people to have an idea of what is inequality, what are you talking about when you mean inequality? And, you know, one word that's helpful is disproportional, disproportionality. So when we have, like, for example, the prison population of black men, is it like, disproportionate. It's like, I don't know, let's say 20, I don't know how the exact number in my head right now, but it's like 25%. So 25% of the prison population in the US is composed of like black men. But that's not representative of the number of black men in the US, right? So there's like a discrepancy there where you would expect to have a proportional representation in the prisons of the population and the diversity of the population in the US. And so this is where somebody might say, oh, CRT might be, you know, of use here, because why is that happening? Why are there so many black men in prisons? Now, some people might have the deficiency kind of argument, or potentially racist argument that says, well, black men are just more criminal, right? That's why they're in prison more. But no, actually, if you look a little bit deeper, you might understand and find out that there have been intentional policies that have discriminated against black men, men of color, communities of color, and children of color, and that have resulted in this disproportionate representation in the prison system. So I just want to give one example because, yes, we can't give an exact mathematical equation to explain all of this. I don't want to. But if you think about like that disproportionality, and you see other things like numbers of stops, you know, numbers of stops and searches, who gets stopped and searched, who gets one type of resources versus another. So these are things that you can examine concretely to try to see where those inequalities lie. Like, I don't know what the threshold is, you know, like 60 versus 40, but like, as far as I'm concerned, if there's a disproportionality, there's an inequality, and that's a problem, right? Like, 1% of inequality for me is not, you know, something we should like reach for. I want 0% of inequality.
You make me think of John Rawls. Many of you probably are familiar with a philosopher from Baltimore, John Rawls. Justice is Fairness. And his book is a really interesting look at if we were to place the veil of ignorance, is what he calls, and make decisions in society around that, and not looking at race or looking at sex. It's just justice is fairness. It's a really simple concept, but it's exactly what you said. It's a really critical look at how we make decisions and how we should make decisions. So here's an interesting one that's kind of related to what you said. This is more of a statement than a question. How do white people cause black people to murder each other in high numbers? I don't have an answer to that question.
Can I say in terms of the Second Amendment, it was if we got rid of handguns and if we just eliminated the Second Amendment, that would cause a massive reduction in murders of all across races. So I mean that would be one thing that white people overwhelmingly support, especially in the Republican Party, which is predominantly white and male, and has galvanized itself around this singular voting issue. And if that although it's not causal, but if we eliminated that opportunity, that option for which it began as a method to call a militia up to put down slave insurrections and put down and commit genocide against Native Americans, if we eliminated that Second Amendment in and of itself, we would have a great deal of de-escalation in many of the conflicts that we see across race, gender, and class. And I think that that's something that we have to think about in terms of confronting, especially in Anne Arundel County, where we have a gun shop almost on every corner. And we have Meade High School is less than a mile away from a gun shop. Northeast Middle School is there's advertisements leading up to a pawn shop that has guns. It says guns, guns, guns as you're leaving the school. And so there's just opportunities rife within Anne Arundel County to.
Well, you will get no argument out of me on escalation.
If we can we
And
end at 8:30.
conflict. Not at all. We have a couple more questions on that. Make sure you try to get
This
to
is
as many as
8:30.
you
We
can.
end at 8:30, please.
Oh yeah, we got it hard. We got 3 minutes. Okay, so we'll be in there. Is it true that teachers were encouraged to use Ibram Kendi's book Anti-Racist to develop activist and lesson plans? Kendi states the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. I don't know that that statement is true, but I guess the question to you, Dr. Hughes, Dr. Hughes, is was that the case? Was the book encouraged to use lesson plans?
Not to my knowledge, however, with 127 schools, but there has been no edict that I am aware of from the central office. In fact, when it comes to curriculum, for each of the content that we provide, there are a plethora of auxiliary resources that are available to the teachers that they can use. It could have been in one of those, it could have been in one of those auxiliary, I don't know that. But as far as an edict that they use it, I'm pretty certain that that's not the case.
Well, thank you very much. We have all but 8 questions asked, so I think that is phenomenal considering the stack of questions that we have. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for coming, for attending, for staying with us so long. If we could give our panelists a round of applause. And I also want to thank Eugene and the rest of the Anne Arundel County Human Relations Commission for putting this forum together. It was fantastic. One of the statements was, can we have more of these types of discussions? So I think you've got your work cut out for you.
Yes, we do, and the answer is yes, we will.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Where are you going?